libraries, the federal government, and the future of environmental history in Canada.
You know, it appears that a lot of this stuff was just given away or taken away. I mean, and some of it was extraordinarily valuable.
I'm Sean Courage, and you're listening to episode 41 of Nature's Past, a podcast of the Network in Canadian History and Environment. In 2012, the Canadian federal government began closing and consolidating many of its departmental libraries. More than a dozen research libraries have closed at Parks Canada, Environment Canada, Natural Resources Canada, Foreign Affairs, Citizenship and Immigration, Human Resources and Skills Development, the National Capital Commission, Intergovernmental Affairs, Public Works and Government Services, Canada Revenue Agency, Transport, Infrastructure and Communities, and Canadian Heritage. And in December, the government began closing all but 4 of its 11 Department of Fisheries and Oceans libraries. News reports across the country showed startling images of books and other documents lying in dumpsters, with rumors that others may have been burned. The culling of these libraries involved what has been described as a haphazard free-for-all, with members of the public and industry scooping up abandoned books and valuable so-called grey literature, unique intergovernmental publications. The process of library consolidation and closure seems to have happened so quickly that books that were still out on loan weren't even recalled. And beyond the loss of material, we still don't know the full extent of the personnel losses. As library staff get laid off, valuable human knowledge vanishes along with the books. One thing that stands out in this troubling story is the degree to which the library closures have targeted scientific and environmental research branches of the government. These libraries housed historical research materials of great relevance to Canada's environmental history, and as such, they're likely to have a detrimental impact on our ability to know about the past. We decided then on this episode to find out more about this issue by speaking with Andrew Nikiforuk, a writer and journalist for the Tyee.ca, who has written extensively on this topic. I also sat down with a panel of environmental historians to get their take on the potential impact these closures might have on Canadian environmental history. So Andrew, thanks for joining us here to tell us a little bit about the reporting you've been doing on the closure of federal fisheries and other federal libraries. Can you just set up a little bit of the context to explain what's been happening to these libraries across Canada?
Well, it's a large story that involves nearly 2 dozen specialized federal libraries that serve various departments in government. So, for example, Parks Canada used to have 5 libraries. Now they have 1. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans used to have 11 libraries. They have closed 7, and now they have 2 central locations actually remaining, and 2 smaller locations. So this has been a really dramatic downsizing of federal libraries that are critically important. I mean, you've got to look upon them as public infrastructure, intellectual capital, if you will, that is serving policymakers as well as federal scientists.
Now, we're seeing in reports across the country photographs of books and other documents in dumpsters. When you say downsizing, are we talking about the destruction of records?
Well, that's what the big debate is about. The federal government itself, in a secret memo, has described the closure of the scientific libraries at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans as a culling. And it happened so quickly and so haphazardly that books on loan were not called back. That a lot of material ended up in dumpsters and went off to the landfill, or in some cases might even have been burned. The public was invited actually to come in and scavenge through what remained of the Eric Marshall Aquatic Research Library in Winnipeg, which is really one of the world's largest and best freshwater libraries. And so scientists were not consulted about this process. There is no clarity about what was saved and what was thrown out. And there is no clarity. Scientists are most concerned about the fate of grey literature. Now, grey literature are those reports and documents and theses and conference proceedings written by academics and technicians and scientists that really have no commercial publisher. And there's tens and thousands of these documents, and some of them are extremely vital and contain really good baseline data on the state of a particular river or fishery or whatever. And the government said that they were digitizing. Well, the government doesn't have the copyright to digitize these materials, so it is unclear what happened to them. And scientists fear that in many cases it was simply thrown out.
Do you have a sense of any other kind of documents or records that are being potentially lost or going missing?
Well, they're at the Freshwater Institute. The Freshwater Institute Library, it's also known as the Eric Marshall Aquatic Research Library in Winnipeg, had phenomenal collection of stuff. I mean, they had a lot of material associated with the Berger Commission dating back to the 1970s and Arctic gas exploration, and a lot of really good baseline data on rivers and lakes and in that region. They had a remarkable collection of just rare books and diaries by Arctic explorers that all contain pretty important information about the state of a lot of fresh waterways. And it appears that a lot of this stuff was just given away or taken away. I mean, and some of it was extraordinarily valuable. Again, we do not know what was culled. We do not know what was consolidated. We do not know what was shipped off to the two remaining central libraries. And scientists fear that all the stuff that was boxed might never even get out of boxes and will be lost forever.
So it seems clear, though, that there hasn't been a lot of disclosure from the federal government on this process of consolidation of the libraries and elimination of records. Where are you getting your sources as you're doing the reporting on this story?
My sources have been scientists who use these libraries and depend on them on a regular basis, and my sources have also been librarians who were responsible for these libraries. Right. And so I've got a story coming out actually in a couple of days about a librarian talking about the whole experience and how chaotic and rushed it was and how unrealistic the timelines were. I mean, the government said, look, we're closing this down. We're going to close 7 major libraries containing hundreds of thousands of material, and we're going to consolidate them into 2 remaining libraries. And to do that, we're going to have to cull material from these 2 libraries to make room from the 7 libraries we're consolidating. And by the way, we're going to do that in practically less than a year.
Wow.
So, it's most of the librarians and scientists I've talked to say this is completely unprecedented. They say that has absolutely nothing to do with money because it only costs about $430,000 a year to operate these libraries. Meanwhile, the federal government is spending $40 million a year on global PR to advertise the tar sands as a form of responsible development, when in fact Canada has no effective climate action change plan, and we've trashed a lot of our freshwater science programs and gutted our 3 major pieces of environmental legislation. So it's a pretty extraordinary situation. And what it really represents is that we're seeing a major shift in how the government operates and its mandates, and we're seeing a real move towards minimalist government and by a government that frankly does not believe in government. I mean, Stephen Harper doesn't believe the federal government should play a significant role in setting public policy. He thinks business in the marketplace should be doing that.
So does that take us partly to explaining why the government is taking this action?
I think that explains part of the reason. I think a part of it is that you've got a lot of bureaucrats who are so fearful of the government that they're trying to achieve something they can't really achieve in the timelines they were given, and so you end up with a botched process. I mean there are a number of things that have gone on here. And then I think you also have, a very strong ideological position by the conservative government, and a strong belief that really, we shouldn't be operating these kind of science research stations, and if we're such as the experimental lakes area, and if we're not operating them, then we don't need libraries that were set up to serve this research, and so we're just going to shut them down, and we're going to reorient the government towards different things, and that is, supporting corporations, fish farming or whatever is on the government's agenda.
And I guess one of the ironies is that these libraries actually did serve some corporate interests. The research that federal fishery scientists, at least, have long been used for the industry itself. So there's certainly a kind of loss there.
There's a huge loss, because the St. Andrews Biological Station had a phenomenal library that had been newly renovated and climate controlled and the whole bit, and it served a very important contaminant research program at the St. Andrews Biological Station. That contaminant research program is gone. The experimental lakes area at the Freshwater Institute was one of the world's most famous facilities for studying the effect of pollutants and contaminants on fresh water. That's gone. And now the library that served it is also gone. We had a phenomenal ocean marine facility at the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Center in St. John's, critical for studying the cod fishery. That's gone. So there's a pattern here. I mean, the government has not just, gotten rid of a whole bunch of libraries. It has done away with the research field stations that these libraries served, at the same time that it has rewritten the nation's environmental legislation, diminishing and downgrading it to the point that the mandate, for example, to protect fish habitat is gone. I mean, it's been removed from the Fisheries Act. So if you're changing things at just a fundamental level like that, and you're a member of the Harper government, and think, okay, well, we don't have to worry about fish habitat anymore. Then what do we need freshwater science for, and fishery science for, and what the hell do we need libraries supporting those scientists for?
And I guess from your perspective, what do you see as the consequences of this policy and the closure of these libraries and the loss of these resources?
Well, I think what we're seeing is the dismantling of critical public infrastructure that taxpayers built over decades for very powerful geographical reasons. I mean, we have the longest coastline in the world. We have we hold and protect some of the world's largest collection of fresh water, and so there's a reason why we had these research stations. And there's a reason why we had libraries dedicated to the study, protection, and history of our oceans, freshwater, and fish. And that's part of our heritage as a country. To dismantle that and chuck a lot of it away, it's what scientists have called a national tragedy and information destruction unbecoming for a democracy. And, we are a diminished country for this. And, the rest of the world is watching this, and they're appalled, frankly. They think, why would a democracy in the so-called information age do away with so much of its history and so much critical information about the state of its waterways? There are other implications here too. In terms of court cases and upholding existing public policy protecting fish or environment. If you need documents to help enforce the law, they were in these libraries, and where are they now? And that was certainly a big issue in the United States when the George Bush administration did exactly the same thing as the Harper government and dismantled libraries at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency.
So where can listeners go to read more about what you've written and what you will be writing about this important public issue?
Well, listeners can go to the tyee.ca, and you can read various stories that I've written about scientists and librarians talking about the significance and importance of what has been done, it's a good source of information.
That's great. Thanks so much for letting us know a little bit more about this story, Andrew.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for your interest.
Okay, this is Stephen Bocking, and I'm with the Environmental and Resource Science Studies program at Trent University.
Hi, I'm Alan McCacker, and I teach history at Western University.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Hubbard. I teach history of science and technology at Ryerson University.
Hi, this is Will, and I've just completed my PhD in Canadian history and environmental history at Carleton University in Ottawa.
Hi, my name is Dean Bavington. I teach in the geography department at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland.
Well, thank you, everybody, for taking a little bit of time to sit down and talk about these closures of federal libraries across several different departments of the federal government, and to discuss the potential impact that this is might have on environmental history research in Canada. So I wanted to begin the conversation by getting a sense of the degree to which you have used the resources in these federal libraries. And maybe I'll start with Will, who wrote an article recently for Active History about the library closures in the fishery libraries. What's been your experience working in these libraries, and what kind of materials were you using?
Sure. So I've used the library at the Nanaimo Biological Station. I've also used other federal libraries as well, so I just will point to those as well. I've done research in the Department of Agriculture library, which I believe is now closed as well. And I've also done a lot of research actually recently in the libraries of the national museums here, and that is another fear of mine too, that those will be affected by these closures and cutbacks. The research that I did at Nanaimo Biological Station Library, that's going on 7 years now, but it was, and I was actually doing research on behalf of Stephen for his aquaculture research project. And I mean, I've described that library as a treasure trove, and I'm sure people who worked in the other libraries would agree. I mean, these were just such a rich resource of not just books, but of gray literature, and that's really been, I think, the major concern with the closure of these libraries, is that there's just this wealth of kind of inaccessible or uncatalogued information.
Jennifer, you've worked in fishery libraries, is that right?
I have. I also worked at the Nanaimo Library, and it was, in fact, just a wonderful location. And it's a huge disappointment that it's been closed. I've done archival research there because they also had a lot of documents that they'd retained from letters and so on. And I have no idea if it's gone into the National Archives. It's gone into a kind of black hole now.
What are the sort of materials that you were using in that library? What are the kind of things that might be lost or inaccessible now?
Well, I share Alan's concern that it's got, we're losing the gray literature, that it's hard to catalog, that there's material that's not easily accessible, and just also the physical proximity of this material, so that you can see how it was organized. It's a huge loss.
Now, Alan, you've used the Parks Canada libraries. Can you give us a sense about what kind of research materials you were finding there, and how you were using that for historical research?
Sure. I got to say that closure is almost historical itself at this point now. It was I used it up until about 10 years ago. It was in Hull, which is now Gatineau, I guess, and the Parks Canada Library was a wonderful place to do research because it had so much, as you'd expect, as Will said, in terms of what's called gray literature, the internal literature of the Department of Parks Canada. It also had a great secondary literature as well. It also had, I think, material that was essentially archival that was just sitting in the library shelves there. And I just came back one time to visit it, and the library was gone. And as I said, that was almost 10 years ago now, probably. And the staff that was remaining in front of a couple terminals were rather sheepish, because it was clear that some of the material had made it back to Library and Archives Canada, but it was also clear that they weren't really clear themselves where some of the material had ended up.
So there is some archival material that exists outside of Library and Archives Canada in each of these departmental libraries, uncatalogued or cataloged?
I think this was cataloged. I think the material I'm talking about was kind of a one-of-a-kind material that probably should have made it to the archives, but my guess is it didn't. with luck, it made it to the library, but it's hard to say where some of it ended up.
So, Dean, where has your research come into contact with these types of repositories and these collections?
Yeah, mainly the DFO library in Ottawa and the one here in St. John's. I guess most of my I guess concern about these closures now has to do with something that I was just made aware of by a former student that worked at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans here in St. John's, and that is where the pre-Confederation Fisheries Archive documents have gone now with this the closure of the library here in St. John's and the consolidation of materials in Halifax. So there's a whole pre-Confederation fishery science and history now basically there's a lot of uncertainty about where these documents are, and they are not available at the provincial archives, the rooms, or at Memorial University's Center for Newfoundland Studies. So I guess in general, there's just a lot of uncertainty, and it seems that there's a lot of ad hoc sort of saving that's been going on by the librarians when they found out that the closures were coming, and then but since the closures have been enacted, there's basically very little communication, well, none occurring now from those former librarians, because if they're still within the age of the department, they're basically under gag orders. I mean, they can't speak about it. So what I've been hearing is that to find out any more information, at least here on the St. John's case, we're going to have to get into freedom of information requests. But maybe we can talk about that a little later.
So when we're talking about pre-Confederation, are we talking about pre-1949 for Newfoundland, or are we talking about earlier in the 19th century?
Well, pre-Confederation with Newfoundland in 1949, which would include both the Commission of Government state phase just prior to 1949 and Newfoundland joining Canada, but also the responsible government phase and the colonial period before that. So it's in 1949, all of those documents became under the purview of Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So that's as when they were created in 1977. But it became a federal responsibility after 1949.
And Stephen, in your research, what kind of materials were you coming across in these federal libraries?
Well, my experience has been kind of corresponding to that of Will and Jennifer, using mainly the Pacific Biological Station Library in Nanaimo. I've only had a chance so far to do kind of a sampling of that library and get a sense of what's available there. So my next visit out to BC, I'm planning to visit the Institute for Ocean Sciences Library in Sydney, near Victoria, which is one of the two DFO libraries that is scheduled to remain open and to receive everything that's been culled from the other libraries. And I'm really wondering what I'm going to be finding when I get there, because kind of thinking about just what other folks have just said now about uncertainty about what now exists, and also just the ad hoc and rushed and unplanned nature of the whole process, because this is one of the two surviving DFO libraries, but according to the DFO docs that have been made available, especially the Andrew Nikiforuk, I think, posted in one of his articles, they said that the DFO policy has been to cull those existing libraries, those surviving libraries as well, to make room for materials from the closed library. So what is to be found in that library will remain to be seen. And I'm especially struck, too, by how DFO has said that they are culling the materials to correspond to the DFO's mandate. And, of course, the DFO itself has really sharply restricted its mandate over the last year or two, as the Fisheries Act has been radically restricted. So there's a lot of stuff now that the DFO in itself would probably decide is no longer relevant to its mandate, but that historically has been really important to its mandate. So there's this kind of real extra layer of uncertainty about what's being saved, I think, that's imposed by the fact that the DFO's current policy is It's much less than it once was.
So,
can I add to that I visited also the Bedford Institute of Oceanography, where the Atlantic material was being put a few years ago, and one of the scientists there who was trying to get this library to save some of his stuff said that they didn't want it because they didn't have room for it. So I'm not quite sure where they're going to put all this stuff from the St. Andrews Biological Station or from St. John's either.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to add to Jennifer's. That was my impression of the Nanaimo library when I visited, and that's going on 7 years now. But that this was also, there was a sense that there was an informal archive too, that people, retiring or scientists retiring were leaving some of their materials with the library, and you could see those, piled on top of filing cabinets, and you just had a sense that there was actually more in that library than was cataloged. And so that, I think there was, there's probably stuff we don't even know has been, what's been lost. And I think that just goes to speak to, to Dean's point about just the amount of uncertainty that surrounds this entire issue.
Well, one of the reasons I brought this panel together was to give listeners a sense of the degree to which historians use these libraries. A lot of the public debate over the closures has focused on scientific data and their availability for scientific researchers and industry researchers. But you've given us a sense here that these libraries actually contain a really rich collection of historical archival materials, much of which is not accessible from the National Archives in Ottawa. Or any of the university libraries or regional archives. Maybe if anybody wants to jump in and give us a sense of what impact you might anticipate the closure of such federal libraries might have on environmental history research in Canada.
Well, I'll jump in with a quick comment. In the project I'm working on that's most relevant to this discussion is my history of salmon farming science in British Columbia. And one of the kinds of information that are really useful for that are records of environmental change since the 1970s up and down the coast. The internal documents produced by the DFO as it's communicating with the BC government and within itself as to when it's developing policy for this new industry. Like, these are very informal documents that are often only made in one or just a few copies, and so they're not likely to be asked for by anybody outside, and so they would not be seen as being in demand, and so would not likely be digitized or even kept. These records of environmental change, like local changes in oceanographic conditions or local fish abundance and so on, they'll never be published. Environmental assessments of individual salmon farms, those kinds of things, that, among other things, are really useful in understanding why the salmon farming industry, for example, decided to shift up the coast a couple of 100 kilometers in the 1980s. Like, that was a real radical change for the industry, and you need to figure out why that shift happened. And there's speculation about that, but understanding what environmental conditions the salmon farmers were actually dealing with is really a big part of that puzzle. And if those records are chucked, then we'll really never know about that aspect of the environmental history of the industry.
Well, and I could just build on that, because I'm starting to look at the history of the salmon farming industry here in Newfoundland, which has started much later. And without that, we always look to BC for the history of how the industry developed there to learn lessons on the East Coast. And again, I'm seeing with the loss of that story and the details of the story, there can't be these lessons learned, including in very practical, or what we think to be practical and pragmatic, policy research. And I think this goes back to something that Stephen was mentioning around the already hollowed out or cut back DFO structure. And I think what we've seen is really a gutting of the regulatory arm of the agency in favor of the development arm, which and I think that the types of policy focused on regulation and sort of controlling industry and development that could potentially harm fish habitat, to enabling the development of projects that may impact on fish habitat, for energy industry, but also for the promotion of aquaculture within the agency. And I think those within DFO that are developing aquaculture tend to come from a background more focused on business, economics side of things, and they don't tend to have much respect for history because they're thinking about developing things, progress. Whereas the regulatory arm, they were very, very much interested in history and the types of data that was there on that side. So I think we're also seeing sort of neoliberalism at play here with the rolling back of regulations and the rolling out of development, and how history is seen by those two functions of the state.
Hey, Sean, can I follow up with a follow-up to that about to what Dean has said about data? And I think a related point to this is that I'll use the Environment Canada library in Downsview as my example, but I'm sure that this probably I'm sure this feeds in different ways for different government libraries across Canada. When I visited the Downsview office a number of years ago, I found that they had a large, what was clearly an archival collection, including every meteorological observation from 1840 was sitting in paper copy down in their basement. And they'd been trying for on and off for about 40 years to get that to Library and Archives Canada. And for a variety of reasons, Library and Archives Canada wasn't ready to accept it, because even though it seemed quite obviously to everyone, or at least everyone at the Environment Canada side, as nationally significant, these were hundreds of thousands of pages of observations, which means forms, which means data. And I think in the 1970s, at least, to those working in Libraries and Archives Canada, it didn't feel archival, it didn't look archival. And my sense is that these government libraries possess a lot of material that we would now recognize as being of archival value, but they're in their libraries because, for a variety of reasons, but one reason being that they never made their way to Library and Archives Canada.
And maybe, Jennifer, if you want to give us a sense of how you think these kinds of restrictions on access to federal library materials might affect environmental history research.
Well, I have to agree with what has been said already by other panelists, that we're losing access to past data that will, as Dean was saying, for the regulatory side of things, it's actually a very good check on whether or not there have been mistakes made in the past and what steps were made to remediate these mistakes in things like aquaculture. And in addition, we're also losing information about how the scientists themselves were operating. And the historians of science are interested in the motivations, the circumstances in which certain research was occurring, and that information is being lost as well. And it's just going to make historians' research impossible. And this is very unfortunate, because it's at a time when the fishery science is turning to history in general. There's a lot more interest in the history of the discipline, the history of the research that's been done, and historical reconstruction going back to the 19th century of fish stocks. And this is being rendered impossible in Canada.
So can any of these materials be found in sort of comparable or duplicate copy in university libraries or provincial archives or in Library and Archives Canada, or are we talking about materials that are only available in the libraries that are closing?
Can I jump in there?
Sure.
U of T used to have a library in the zoology department, which got closed down at some point in the late 90s or early 2000s, and I was totally unaware of it, the closing at the time. But it had the Huntsman room, which was full of gray literature. It's just a fabulous research location, but it's all gone, and I have no idea where the information went. I know a few of the journals went into the ROM, but where most of the material ended up, I don't know, and I think quite a bit of it must have been dumped.
Yeah, that's, I think, the great fear is we don't know what's gone. We don't know what's been digitized. And just to circle back to your last question, Sean, I proposed for a postdoc project a study of marine vermin, of eradication and control efforts to control populations of like cormorants and seals and dogfish, and it's that kind of the gray literature I found is really usually the stuff that I've encountered. It's really local, like really dealing with local specific problems, and that's the sort of information and documents that I'm going to need to access to complete this project. And all of a sudden, the closure of these libraries and the consolidation of the material and no real sense of where this has gone and what's been lost really throws, that project, gives me doubt about my ability to carry that out.
Well, do we know of any salvage efforts or any of the university libraries getting involved in trying to acquire some of the material before it's either destroyed or warehoused in an inaccessible manner?
I could talk to that for a moment, Sean.
Sure.
After coming upon these meteorological records at at Environment Canada, Downsiew's office, I started talking to them about whether or not that they would consider a long-term loan of this material to Western, and it's taken years. I mean, I first visited Downsview, and because I'm a historian, they take me down to the basement to see their old stuff. It was 6 years ago that I first visited, and it's taken 6 years, and we're finally getting to the point now that the material is going to come to Western for long-term loan. But I guess the timing of this just happens to be timing of these library closures. Mm-hmm. But really, I guess I would kind of urge universities now, or university researchers, that if they're thinking of taking this route, it can take time. I mean, I think it might be speeded up in the present environment, but it takes a long time to work out the deals of an arrangement like this. And even then, I think it's going to be obviously very hit or miss. It's going to happen with some universities and some libraries, but a lot of times it's just not going to happen.
I'll just say a word too about that. That's been the experience at my own university too. That one thing that to encounter very quickly when try to check about the interest of the university archive in material is that it has to correspond to the archive's collection policies, and as often as not, it doesn't, because that's already defined very much in advance. And I think university archives generally, I think, are probably resistant to serve as an archive of last resort for other archives that are closing, and so they would resist being available to receive the leavings from DFO.
I also don't think there's been a lot of communication between, I don't think that we had a lot of advance warning that this was going to happen. Mm-hmm. The decision was made the summer before last, and things were gone by last year. So
I know the Canadian Association of Research Libraries is trying to get that straightened out now, exactly who was contacted at universities, because there's words that universities have been contacted, but whether the right people at universities or even the libraries or archives at universities were contacted is another question. And they're trying to find the history of that now to figure out exactly what they knew and when they knew it.
I think the salvage effort, if there has been anything, has been really haphazard. I mean, I've heard that, and I think Andrew Nikiforuk has reported on this, and I've heard from a separate source as well, that library material that were in people's offices weren't recovered. And so that material, it's sort of inadvertent or random salvage, right? It's material that hasn't been returned to the library in time for that material to be cleared away. So that's a sort of speaks to, I think, the kind of the sloppy way that this has been done. And I just wanted to John Dupuis, the science librarian at York and the science blogger, noted that culling and consolidation is a part of normal library operations. And so, but the issue for him, and I think we need to, keep in mind, is that it's just been such, it just seems so quickly done without any without any transparency, without any advice from stakeholders in it, and that then it's been carried out in a sloppy and haphazard manner. And I think we've all seen the photograph of the material dumped into the bin, into the dumpster in the Quebec Library, and that I think has caused a lot of justified fear about how this has been done.
Yeah, and we'll link listeners to John Dupuy's writing on this issue for sure. I maybe want to pose a new question for the group, and maybe one that's a little bit more complicated, but highly relevant, I think, for our listeners, and that is what role environmental historians should play as a research community in terms of responding to the library closures. Does anybody want to provide a little bit of feedback on that question of what kind of response there should be from the research community?
It's funny, Sean, that question actually prompted me to follow the advice I was going to give here, and that was to write their MPs and the Prime Minister and the Minister of Fisheries, which I did this morning, because I'd written a blog post for Active History and for Stephen's blog about the issue, and I realized after, we need to make our views known to politicians. And there's actually, and this is maybe a link that you can put up, there's also a petition at evidencefordemocracy.ca about the library closure. So those are sort of like kind of quick and easy things to do.
Yeah, I was able to ask, not directly, but I was able to ask the librarians here at DFO, what would be an appropriate response here. And anybody that sort of knows how the government decision-making was made is saying that there would have had to be a plan put forward, quite detailed plan to have the closures, and that this plan would have outlined, where these materials were to go. So even though it certainly appears now, because of all the uncertainty and in many ways the production of ignorance around what's happened, that we haven't, maybe the first step on or what I've been told is to start, and what I'm going to take on is to start learning about freedom of information requests and how to actually word an appropriately worded freedom of information requests that can get the information that we need to find those internal planning documents. But again, that's just what I've been advised by people on the inside. If we want to find out, that would be the first step, and I imagine it's journalists that have that expertise, I'm thinking.
Another step that might be useful would be to perhaps reach out and make some kind of common cause with scientists, because so much of what we're working on is similar to what scientists are working on, in the sense that historians are using scientific information, and a lot of scientists, as Jennifer mentioned, are using historical information, and scientists have had huge success in getting this whole issue of closures on the public agenda, and it would make sense to kind of add the voice of historians to that voice that already exists out there in the public.
The problem is, of course, that they're afraid to put their names to this. I had a scientist contact me wishing to remain anonymous if the information went further, that he tested my assertion that about 20% of the grey literature is missing. He randomly selected 6 titles, and of them, one was supposed to be at the BIO library, and it wasn't, in hard copy. And the 5 digitized ones, he could only find 1. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, that's just shocking information, but he doesn't want his name attached to it.
Well, I suppose for listeners, the first step will be to learn a little bit more about the issue, and hopefully this episode has taken us a little bit further there. We'll be linking to the writing of several journalists and others who have been covering the story of the library closures, and I want to thank everyone here for joining us for a little bit to tell us about the impact that this has had or may have on environmental history research in Canada.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Sean.
Yes, thank you, John.
To find out more about the federal library closures and to get involved, visit canadaspastmatters.ca. Nature's Past is produced with support from the Network in Canadian History and Environment. This episode was made by Andrew Nikiforuk, Dean Babington, Stephen Bocking, Jennifer Hubbard, Will Knight, Alan McEachern, and me, Sean Courage. Music for Nature's Past was licensed by Creative Commons. For details on the artists, please take a look at our show notes page at niche-canada.org/naturespast, where you can also download new episodes, subscribe to the podcast through iTunes, and leave comments. Please let us know what you think about the podcast, and don't forget to rate and review this podcast on our iTunes page. You can follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/naturespast, and you can now subscribe to the podcast on our new YouTube channel at youtube.com/naturespast. You can always get the latest information on events in the environmental history community from the Niche website at niche-canada.org, and you can find out more about the topics we discussed on this episode on our show notes page. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next month with another episode of Nature's Past.